Preparations of the research area are completed, ma'am. Their securing of cargo is completed, ma'am. Vulnerable crew members have gathered in medical and are all present and accounted for, ma'am. We are ready to proceed. Their living spaces are clear for deceleration, ma'am. One after another, the hopefully near-final updates of the process of Sheeda's team came in over the comm lines. Understood, Sheeda answered, while her eyes glided over the different numbers and values on the screen before her eyes. Finish up the last tasks and head back to the bridge afterwards. I'll trust you to coordinate yourselves on that. Copy that, ma'am. Turning to her right, where Cliff was currently handling the messages coming in from all kinds of other teams on board, Sheeda asked, everything is cleared on our end? How are things overall? The Raxus expertly coordinated around the incoming information, controlling the terminal with quick, precise movements of all four of his wing-like arms. His head moved seemingly erratically, as his stiff eyes kept shifting focus between different areas of the screen. Nothing to report, ma'am. All areas are cleared. We are ready to go, he answered professionally, his tone all business now. Alright, then let's get this beauty docked, Sheeda responded, and with two quick moves of her arm, she summoned up two new interfaces on the terminal. One was a communications window. In real time, the dock of the GCS was sending them their position and parameters, constantly keeping them updated on the exact numbers and values they would need to allow for a problem-free docking. The other interface was the actual manual control of the gravitational spin. Of course, it was still inhibited by the ship's safety system that would not allow any dangerous changes, but overall, she was in control now. The docks of the GCS were basically stations of their own, and so massive that the ships could be flown right into them for docking purposes. For the process of the docking to go smoothly, this meant that the gravitational spin of the dock and the ship had to be synchronized, so that the two vessels would move relative to each other, and therefore appear to be still from their respective perspectives. Since the diameter of the dock was much larger than that of the GES-32, it was rotating much slower to maintain standard gravity. Now it was on Sheeda to make sure that the GES-32's rotation had slowed down enough to match it, once they reached it, as well as doing it in such a controlled fashion that the deceleration would knock everybody off their feet. Opening the communication to the ship's intercoms one final time today, she loudly announced, "To everyone on board the GES-32, to all crew members, this is Petty Officer Sheeda speaking to you. The deceleration of the gravitational spin will now begin. Brace for lower gravity." Slowly, and with minimal assistance of the board's computer for fine-tuning, she started to power the thrusters, tasked with slowing the ship's tangential velocity. Even though the change was minimal, she immediately felt it in her bones, as inertia tried to keep her body moving at its previous speed. Even though she was used to it, the feeling never got any less weird. The values on her screen dropped in a slow but constant fashion. It wasn't long until the effects were noticeable in more than just the feeling of inertia pulling on her. A feeling like going downwards in an elevator filled her body, as her weight dropped slightly with each second that passed, the artificial gravity pulling on her mass less and less. The process was overall uncomplicated but very time-consuming. Only every now and then did Sheeda have to make adjustments on short notice, or momentarily stop the deceleration. However, since she had to be sure that she would catch each of these rare instances, she needed to stay sharp and concentrate, other than during her usual shifts in front of this terminal. "We are about to reach 60% of standard gravity, ma'am," Cliff informed her, after who knows how much time had passed from her right, even though she could see that herself. "Precise assistance is recommended from this point onwards." Sheeda nodded and gave the computer the order. A command window popped up, and she forwarded the constant stream of information they received from the dock into it, allowing the computer to adjust and adapt to the exact numbers they would need. The last few percentage points separating the values of the ship and the dock dropped down slowly. With the now active assistance, the computer corrected even the smallest deviations, as it returned to its usual function of maintaining the set parameters. Sighing and stretching her neck, Sheeda finally returned the terminal to its earlier settings, closing her control window, and now taking back up a more supervisory position again. Of course, following protocol, she still technically remained in manual control over the spin, and could act at any moment, but the computer still automatically maintained the parameters that she had inputted, and therefore there wasn't much that she could still do. Deceleration completed, Sheeta said towards Cliff, who had also taken a moment to release the tension from his posture. Inform the other teams and give the all clear. I'll contact the captain. Yes, ma'am, Cliff confirmed, and started opening the necessary channels. If she was being honest, Sheeta really didn't want to speak to the captain right now. She was still quite upset with him after the stunt he had pulled with James. And their last night together, as well as the additional rumours that were spread, some of them by the two Death Riders themselves, probably had not eased the captain's mind. But duty was duty. Captain, this is Petty Officer Sheeta. The deceleration was successful, and we are maintaining synchronization with the dock. From our side, all things are clear for the docking process, sir, she dryly informed the captain, via a direct communication line to the captain's seat. Very good, Petty Officer. The captain's voice came back out of the terminal. Keep watch over the parameters, and await further orders coming to you soon. Good. At least he didn't seem to want to small talk. Understood, Captain, Sheeta answered, closing the line. Despite the now extremely low gravity, James and Curie were pressed to the ground, trying to get their faces as close to the glass floor as possible. Moore and Quiz stood some paces away from them, watching their display with concern. They also showed no desire to get anywhere close to the window that their two friends were now laying on. James cupped his hands around his eyes, trying to keep out as much light from the ship that caused his face to be reflected in the glass, obscuring his vision of the spectacle surrounding them as possible. Dispersed through the empty space surrounding them were hundreds of colossal metal contraptions, dwarfing the Habitat-style ship they were serving on. And those were merely the docks. He could see them slowly moving past the window as the GES-32 crossed the docking space, the closer ones blocking out his vision of anything else with their enormous forms. And every now and then, when the ship was in an ideal position, he could even see the centre of the sphere formed by the metal mountains. Formed like a moon-sized ring, with its middle filled with frames giving it structure, and holding an ocean of solar and radio panels, making it shine almost as bright as a star from their position, the great community station hovered, turning ever so slowly in place. It wasn't actually still, of course. Like anything, it raced around the galaxy's core with blazing speed, a feat that had taken many engineers many years to achieve when it was first planned. The GCS was situated right in the void, orbiting no close celestial bodies, instead acting as a fixed point in the galactic spiral of the Milky Way itself. It was truly breathtaking in its sheer size alone, and it shone so bright that its light blocked out the vision of most of the surrounding stars. Do we really have to be here of all places? James could hear Moore's voice asking from above. I told you, I am not missing this, he answered, awestruck, trying to wrap his mind around the sheer amount of material and engineering necessary to construct something like this. But I understand if you want to leave. Must be pretty boring standing over there. Boredom is the least of my concerns, Moore answered. James wanted to reply, but a sudden shift in the light gave him pause. The void of space did not allow sound to travel through it, but he was sure if it did, the massive dock opening up would have made an ear-splitting sound. From his position, he could see the giant tube spin in perfect unison with the ship, so he was always facing the same direction of the dock while looking out of the window. Slowly, the floor crawled past his vision, as the ship slowly flew into position to be docked. It looked like a ghost town. All the machines and posts were abandoned, and not a soul was in sight. It was only logical. After all, the atmosphere had most likely been voided while the ship was entering. Not to mention the danger of sailing this close to a running spaceship, if anyone were to still be in the dock while they entered. When the ship had reached what was probably its end position, enormous robotic arms, attached to the dock, started to move towards it and attached to the hull, keeping the ship in place. A small jerk went through the ship as the metals collided with each other. This meant that the thrusters were most likely powered off now. And finally, if he pressed himself to the glass hard enough and strained his eyes, James could see a large metal exit ramp slowly start to emerge from the dock's floor, spiraling around the ship rotation-wise. He knew it would soon also attach to the ship and form their way out and into the dock. Of course, they would have to wait for the atmosphere to be reinstated first. You're safe now, James commented, finally lifting his head again and looking over at Moore. No void of space anymore, just the void of the dock. Moore carefully skulked over towards the window, glancing out of it from her position. "Oh, thank goodness," she said with a relieved breath, and immediately started walking over towards him, followed by Quiz. "You two truly must be out of your minds staring into it like this." "I thought you knew that already," James responded, while lifting himself off the ground and dusting himself off. "It is calming," Curie stated, while also lifting their body back up. "And the stations are a true marvel." "That they are," James confirmed while stretching. Moore seemed to shudder a bit, but apparently James's comment had reminded her that her concerns were not new to the two of them, so she didn't press the issue. A small knocking sound against the wall informed James that Quiz had something to say as well. "I'm glad you had fun, but we should get going soon," they signed, while moving their eyes back and forth between James and Curie. "I'm sure they want you in the first group." "The first group?" Not quite understanding what they meant by that, James simply gave the sign for "explain" towards them, while looking quizzically. Instead of explaining themselves, Quiz looked over at Moore, who took it as a signal to explain it for them. "People react differently to changing gravity. Some handle it better than others, and you do not seem to be affected at all," she said disapprovingly. Apparently James hadn't read the ship's protocols quite well enough for her taste, and would have to rectify that soon. "Since the process of getting everybody off the ship, onto the dock, and then from the dock to the station is quite laborious, there are measures in place to not unnecessarily hold it up. One of those being that the groups first leaving the ship are those that have little to no problem with the changing gravity, giving the ones staying behind an opportunity to slowly acclimate, while not making anyone who doesn't need to wait for them." That did make some sense, and in that case, James would most likely really be in the first group. James looked down the corridor absent-mindedly, running his hands over his uniform to try and straighten out some of the folds that had formed, while laying on the ground in it. "Also, James, I have been meaning to ask you." Moore once more spoke up, a tone changing to one James couldn't quite place. "What are you going to do about your identifier, your uniform?" That was the word. "What are you going to do about your uniform?" James looked up at her and then down at himself again. "What about it?" he confusedly asked, seeing as there appeared to be nothing wrong with it. "Well, you seem to always be wearing it, and you also said that you disliked being undressed before," Moore said. Then her claw started to indicate towards the area around her neck as she continued. "However, since we are not working on the station, we will not be wearing our identifiers there. Of course, most people would simply take them off for the time being, but for you, taking off your uniform seems to have more of an implication to it." As if she felt the need to demonstrate what she had said, she actually reached for her identifier, taking it off from around her neck, and haphazardly stuffing it into the large purse-like bag she was carrying with her on a strap around her shoulders, and that most likely contained everything she was going to take along onto the station. "So, should I change?" James asked. He unwittingly used the galactic uniform word for change, forgetting for a moment that it carried different implications in the context of the conversation. Moore, understandably misunderstanding his question, hastily replied, "Of course, that was not what I was saying. If you are uncomfortable with taking it off, I am sure we will find a different solution. I was merely trying to tell you what people usually do." James was dumbfounded by her reaction for a moment, and looked at her quizzically. This seemed to now also confuse Moore, who looked back at him with the same expression. "I'm not that attached to it," James finally said with an awkward laugh after a while, and started walking over towards his suitcase, which he had deposited at the edge of the large window. "If it's a problem, I'll wear something else." Actually, it was anything but uncomfortable to get to peel out of the uniform for a while. It was a good thing he had planned to go out in casual sometime anyway. That way, he had packed plenty of his own clothes. Since he expected the station to be at the standard temperature, he would gladly wear summer clothes over the long-sleeve uniform. However, he would most likely still want to look presentable, so he opted for a light grey, short-sleeved dress shirt instead of a t-shirt. Alongside it, he wore over-knee shorts of the same colour, although they were checkered by light blue lines running across them. He changed right then and there in the hallway, knowing that nobody would bat an eye at him standing around in his underwear for a moment. "That's better," he loudly said, immediately feeling a lot less hot while closing his suitcase back up. He then turned to his group of friends. "What do you think?" he asked. twirling in place for a second to give them an all-around view. Can I show myself in public like this? He only got hesitant answers, since clearly none of them had any idea what would be the right thing to say. I think there might be someone else you will want to ask that, Moore said, being the first to clearly speak up. I'm sure she'll have plenty to say about it, James responded laughingly, picking up his suitcase and getting ready to get moving. But most people will look at me much more like you are doing than like she is, so I want to hear your thoughts. It looks just as weird as always, Quiz sighed, with brutal honesty. Yes, to be honest, that you are covered in clothes at all will leave much more of an impression than what you are wearing, Moore answered noddingly. I do not think people will be able to tell the difference between good and bad clothes, but at least we are seeing your arms and legs now. James looked at the scars speckling his skin, the most prominent of which, of course, being those left by Sheeta herself. Will those really be less off-putting than sleeves to the average person? At least neither Moore nor Quiz seemed to be bothered by them in the slightest. I like these colours more than the other ones, Curie said, which wasn't very helpful, but did bring a nice bit of positivity into the mix. Well then, at least nothing's changing, James commented with a resigned shrug, and started in the direction of the area where the ramp would connect to the ship. While they started walking, their conversation was momentarily interrupted by the ship's intercoms, informing them that the ship was now docked, and to get ready to leave in an orderly fashion. Honestly, they should think about always having the gravity like this, Moore commented while they crossed the empty corridors, stretching her arms and shoulders. Apparently, feeling almost half of her weight lifted off of her was doing great things for her rolled bones. It's not as nice as it might sound, James responded, being personally used to living way under his species' preferred gravity by now, and feeling the effects it had on him. In fact, at that moment he had to walk very slowly, as their current gravity had to be only about 20% of that of Earth, and any serious step he would try to take would turn into a jump. However, the thought of her age did bring something back into James's mind, that he had somehow completely blocked out in his excitement about the docking. He peeked over at her, trying to see if she was going to continue speaking or if she had just made an offhand comment. As she was seemingly dumb for the moment, he carefully spoke up instead. So, this kind of went under earlier when it really shouldn't have, but apparently I am the worst friend ever and have somehow completely missed you being a mother, Moore. He winced a bit while saying it, hoping that him mentioning it would not restart her agitation at the topic. But Moore had seemingly found her peace with that, at least for the moment, and instead looked merely amused by his coyness. Well, you really do not tend to ask many questions of the people around you, James, she answered, in a faintly criticizing tone. The lightness of her steps and the lower gravity also reflected in the way she was talking while walking, as she sounded much less strange than usual. But you are right, I am a mother of 3 beautiful children. 3 children? So he had been way off. Immediately, questions came up, of course. Questions about the children, as well as her presumable husband or boyfriend or maybe donator, who probably had to exist for her to be able to have children. However, this might also be a sore topic for her, and maybe even something that wasn't exactly his place to ask about. Even asking about her children's gender could be a source of aggravation, he knew from experience. And how old are they? Was the only question he could come up with that he couldn't imagine causing any problems. Well, putting it simply, they are all more or less one uniform year apart in age. My eldest daughter, Kentstar, is about twice your age. Muween, my only son, and also the one that has gotten married, is a year younger, with 3 uniform years. And my youngest, Huumwa, is about your age now, if only just. That did at least clear up names, ages, and presumably genders, so it had apparently been a good question to ask. However, he was stumped as to how to continue the conversation. Anything else? Moore inquired while looking down to him. Well? He answered uncomfortably, wanting to ask questions but not knowing which questions he could ask. He battered his brain, trying to conjure up all the social skills in his body, while looking at Moore conciliatorily. From over his head he could hear Quiz making some sounds he couldn't quite place, some sort of soft croaks, escaping them in short bursts. Wait, were they laughing at him? Well, that is understandable. Your mind is currently quite, let us say, preoccupied, after all, Moore commented, semi-amused. In that moment, James wasn't sure if she was really bad at hiding the sass in her voice, or really good at pretending that she was. These are thrilling times for you, so I cannot expect you to show interest towards the life of some old woman like myself. Not if there is someone so much more exciting occupying your thoughts. Why did this feel like he had just completely lost control over this conversation? Listen, you know it's not like that, James quickly said, trying to keep his voice steady instead of having it break into misplaced embarrassment under the comment. This seemed to amuse Quiz further, their laughter rising in frequency. Moore shook her large head left and right, her fur wildly swinging in the low gravity. Now, James, there is no need to explain yourself. We have all been young once, she said, and now James was sure she knew exactly what she was doing. Sadly, short of just ending the talk then and there wasn't much he could do about it. While he thought, Moore happily continued her monologue. You have to have your priorities in order, after all, and I am more than old enough to understand where my place is. She was taking it a bit far now. All right, I get it, James finally interrupted her, his voice not quite as calm and collected as he had wished to make it. He raised his hands as if to physically stop the conversation. I'm not good at these things, all right? I know that. Moore looked down at him with the eye facing him, and to his surprise she brought one of her claws up, running it smooth side up and down along his exposed triceps area. As he confusedly looked up at her, her face showed an emotion he couldn't yet place. Yes, I know, James, she said in an earnest tone, the sass having disappeared from her voice completely. But not everyone will be as fortunate. Asking questions is important and natural, especially personal ones. They let people know that you see value in knowing them. And if someone is uncomfortable with them, that is something you have to respect after they have let you know, not on the assumption that it might be that way. James looked up at her with big eyes, as what she said only slowly sank in with him. Purely out of force of habit that he had developed in situations similar to these, and in a way that almost every human would almost immediately recognize and had probably used themselves before, James put on a half-mocking, half-affectionate tone, and said in a slow and drawn-out way, Yes, Mom. He should have known that that wasn't something universally understood. In fact, he actually knew that, since he immediately recognized his mistake. Given the situation, it was in especially poor taste. However, his tongue had been faster than his mind this time. He saw Moore look at him, quite taken aback. He also felt Quiz's and curious eyes on him from outside of his vision. He could feel the blood rushing to his face, and this time, he really was embarrassed. Taking a deep breath, he once more raised his arms and mumbled, Okay, I can explain. A moment of silence, then Quiz broke out into their so far biggest bit of loud croaking, apparently not even bothering to try and restrain themselves anymore. To James's bigger surprise, Curie's synthetic voice now also rang out, imitating what sounded like human laughing almost uncomfortably well. Moore's reaction was more restricted, only resulting in a small chuckle. Sometimes I do forget, she said understatedly. James, now also chuckling awkwardly, not quite sure what was so funny, could only respond with, Forget? Moore nodded. Yes, sometimes I forget that it is actually a brain working on your head and not a processor, she admitted in her restrained amusement. Was she calling him a robot? Admittedly, he had been a bit reserved when it came to personal stuff since he had entered the ship, but he hadn't been that cold, had he? I knew I was bad at this, he said, diffidently, rubbing his neck, but I didn't think I was that bad. Moore shook out her fur, a lot more forcefully than she usually did due to the low gravity. That is not what I mean, she said mildly. A knock above his head, James looked up and towards Quiz. James, don't worry. We know that you are an affectionate person, they signed down towards him, as he simply observed from below. But boy, you have to be aware that most of the time you seem to be completely untouchable. I don't understand, James had to admit. He wasn't keeping up with the conversation anymore. By now, he wasn't embarrassed as much as he was simply lost. Quiz and Moore looked at each other for a moment, as James looked around between the two. With a gesture of her hand, Moore indicated Quiz that they should be the one to keep explaining. You are not a cold person, James. We are not suggesting that. At least not as long as you want to be, Quiz signed, while trying their best to look at James while walking. However, I don't know if this is a human thing or a you thing, but it always seems like it is exactly that. Your choice. Most of the time, everything you do and every emotion that you show seems to be like something you let happen, rather than something that happens to you. It's like you can just flip a switch every so often and stuff doesn't get to you anymore. Of course, slip-ups happen, but they appear to be the exception rather than the norm. That didn't sound like him, at least to his ears. But hadn't Sheeta said something similar? About wires and bolts? No, that was in reference to his stamina. Still, that made 2 times he had been called a robot by aliens. I think you may be exaggerating a bit, he replied, trying to wave it off. Moore, who still sounded amused, interjected. James, I have personally seen you have your arm ripped open and joke about it seconds after. You dove into a recently exploded and currently burning laboratory, and apparently teased Sheeta with stories of body replacements almost right after. From what I have heard, all that a test of stopping weapons on you could do was mostly bore you after, and that is only stating the obvious. We are not exaggerating. Well, when you put it like that, James mused out loud, and scratched his cheek. Actually, it was a good question, now that he thought of it. Most of those were things that he could see other humans do, theoretically, but he also knew that it wasn't too likely that many would react like him. The only time you ever seem to get your scales cracked is when it is either about Sheeta or Curie. Quiz continued Moore's explanation, bobbing their body up and down while signing. Hey, now you're being unfair, James countered with a slight amusement. I would react the same way if it was about any of you. I've just never seen you get into trouble. Then he thought about it for a bit and continued. I guess you're right, though. I just don't really let stuff get to me, so it doesn't bother me when I'm the only one being affected. While he said that, he thought about past events when he had gotten bent out of shape. Most of those indeed weren't about him. Some of his thoughtfulness must have leaked into his voice, because after hearing his response, Quiz quickly signed, I smell a story behind that. From the looks of it, Moore seemed to share their sentiment, as Sergei seemed very interested in that right now. James chuckled, and brushed his hair out of his face. Well, now that we have the chance, I should probably tell it to you over a drink or something, he said grinningly. We can make a night of it. I'm sure there are plenty of stories between all of us. That would also create an environment in which he would feel comfortable asking some questions, even if he didn't mention that right then. I will hold you to that, Moore jokingly warned him, pointing with a single claw at him. James answered with a laugh. I won't try to get out of it. A general bit of laughter ensued. Nothing really funny had happened, they just all felt like laughing. As James ended his own bout of laughter, he took a deep breath, letting it out with a small, satisfied sigh, regaining his composure. For a moment, everyone was silent. Hey, James! Curie's voice rang out right next to him, breaking the silence. What's up, Curie? He responded, turning towards his cyborg companion. I like the way that you are, they said, looking at him with those big, red eyes of theirs. Aw, thank you, Curie, James answered, suppressing his urge to pull them in and lay his arm around their shoulders. Instead, he just looked at them honestly. I like you too. After that, the group quickly arrived at their destination, stepping right into a large crowd of people, waiting right at the exit ramp, and being semi-organized by the present security guards. James looked around, seeing some familiar faces, but not the one he was looking for. I'm guessing the ranking crew stays on the ship a bit longer, he mused, as people he knew to be in the crew were completely absent from the first group of people to leave the ship. Although they were slightly harder to distinguish, now that nobody was wearing their identifiers. Well, they were absent except for one. Of course he would be here, he thought, looking at his own personal shadow, Officer Reprique himself. Moore answered his query calmly while looking around, trying to follow his gaze. Yes, they will stay until the process is completed. You will have to wait a bit until Sheeta can join us. James made an acknowledging sound, as the security guard, whom he recognized as the one who had maced him just a day prior, approached them. I guess you should be in the first group, he said, clearly addressing James, although his eyes were pretty much glued to Curie as he neared them. Follow me, please. James and Curie got ready, but Moore turned to Quiz before she moved. I will see you on board, she said, causing James and Curie to turn on the spot. Quiz was waving goodbye as they looked at them. Oh, James said surprisingly, quickly making a few steps back to probably say goodbye as well. Yeah, see you soon. Curie just waved back at Quiz. Then they followed the guard towards the entrance of the ramp. It was a bit weird seeing this giant hallway that had suddenly just attached to the wall of the ship, behind which usually just lay the void of space. The guard was studying his assistant intently, making some inputs every now and then. "Alright, we're just waiting for the all-clear from the dock," he finally said, looking up and addressing the group before him. "I'll have to ask you not to dawdle in the dock and immediately make your way to the shuttle as soon as you get out of the ramp. We have an entire ship to evacuate, after all." A myriad of sounds of confirmation sounded out from the crowd, while James merely nodded his head. He couldn't help but notice more interestedly eyeing the guard while he talked. He wondered why that was. Even in the middle of the crowd of people, their little group had a nice bubble of personal space around them, which James attributed to Curie's presence. The dock didn't make them wait long, and the all-clear was quickly given, beginning their exodus off the ship. In an orderly fashion, the crew members stepped into the ramp, slowly marching along its spiral. James had to admit, even in this low gravity, walking an incline while the gravity slightly increased with each step you took was oddly taxing. He didn't even want to imagine how it felt for those around him whose muscles weren't hardened in super high gravity. Most of them huffed and puffed while making the march. He did note that Rapri didn't seem to have a problem with it, however. The officer wasn't even bothering to try to hide right now, which was logical, but still felt odd to James. In the end, their way was only so long, and the end of the ramp was quickly reached as they stepped out into the large area of the dock, a small team of workers already waiting for them, quickly hurrying them along. James looked around in awe. It reminded him of the first time he had stepped into a large airport, having to wrap his mind around the unreasonably high ceilings. Now he stood in a colossal tube and was able to look up and see an entire spaceship just chilling out right above him in the middle of the room. Having walked the halls of the GES-32 for months now, he needed a bit to process that it could really just be flown right into the dock. The smooth, metallic outside of the ship, only interrupted by the window corridors that looked way similar from the outside than from the inside, and some thrusters sticking out as metal tubes here and there, reflected the light shown onto it by the surrounding dock. He was really glad he didn't have megalophobia right now, looking at the mind-boggling sizes of the machinery around him. Even though they started moving immediately, their way through the massive dock was long, and it took them some time of trotting after the workers before they had reached the shuttle ramp. "Take a seat, fill the rows all the way up, and strap in," one of the workers unenthusiastically ordered, as the massive, airtight door opened in front of them, revealing a large, empty room with an even bigger gate on its other side, most likely leading out into the void. In the middle of the room, a shuttle was waiting for them, its entrance ramp wide open. It looked surprisingly a lot like the space shuttles that Earth had long ago used in a discontinued space program, at least form-wise. Then again, there probably weren't much better ways to design what was essentially a bus through space. Just slap wings and a thruster on a regular bus, make it a bit more aerodynamic for flavour, even though there was no air to be dynamic for, and there you go, you got a shuttle. Keeping previous interactions in mind, James decided to let Curie have the place right at the wall, taking up his own position next to them. He wondered if the shuttle was selected with the people making up their group in mind, since nobody seemed to have any problems with the seats offered to them. Although he did feel a little silly, since the seats were much larger than himself, making him feel like a child while strapping himself in with the padded safety belts. An alarm quickly appeared, as multiple red lines of text, as the pilot informed them, "Ready for takeoff! Brace yourselves!" The whole process was streamlined beyond belief. On Earth, this process would take at least another half an hour before they could get going. Muffled by the shuttle's walls, James could hear the enormous gate outside open, even though he couldn't see it due to the shuttle's lack of any windows, and with a jolt, they started to move. The very same lack of windows didn't allow him to have any perception of how their flight was advancing, so he was stuck looking around the shuttle's interior or at the other crew members until he felt the shuttle decelerating again. Most people around seemed a lot more nervous about the whole process than he was, which confused him, since this was only his second time on a small craft like this. He added claustrophobia to the list of fears he was especially happy to not have today. With another jolt, feeling like a reverse of the first, they had apparently landed. "We have arrived. A moment of patience while the atmosphere is being reinstated, please," the pilot informed them. James wondered how fast they had flown to arrive here so quickly. The whole thing just felt so unceremonious to him. A feeling that wasn't held once they were allowed to leave the shuttle, and immediately were hurried out of the room once more. The landing area looked much like the room they had taken off in, as if they had come out of the same mould. The gate opened, and James distractedly stepped out, wondering if the rooms were indeed designed with the exact same blueprints. "The crew of the GS-32? A voice asked from the front of the group, causing James to finally look forward, and his eyes widened. He had expected to step into some sort of welcoming area, where they could be recorded or checked in or something, but instead the landing area had opened right into the thick of it, allowing them to step out into what looked like the galaxy's biggest mall. People were hustling and bustling around them in all shapes and sizes, using many walkways snaking through mid-air, apparently being separated by speed and size of their users. He counted at least 3 each of 4 different types of walkways, with exits off them every 100 meters or so. Further above them, what looked like rails were attached to the walls with long support beams, and here and there James could even see what looked like gondolas slowly drive along below the incredibly high ceilings. The area was littered with all types of markets or services, many of which he couldn't even fathom right that second, and it looked like an entire colour palette had exploded on the area around him. He was so awestruck of having stepped from the sterile dog right into what appeared to be the heart of life on the station, that he didn't even notice the owner of the voice that had spoken to them. "Oh, and you must be his resident human, right? Welcome aboard," it said. Surprised to be addressed directly, James shot around. Out of habit, he already lifted his head to try and look the probably much larger person in the face while talking to them. However, even then his eyes had to move up, and they kept moving up. James had met many people since he entered space, many of them unsettling to the human mind. However, this was the first time that his triple F instinct really kicked in, and his brain screamed, "Run!"